Welcome to another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. You're listening to a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State, featuring writer, poet, and musician Rick Pidcock. Now here's Rick.
Over the past couple weeks, we've been following a story about the spread of authoritarian Christian patriarchy to Washington, D.C. from Doug Wilson's Christ Church in Moscow, Idaho, through one of his disciples, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. In episode 48 of Highest Power, Church and State, I interviewed journalist and author Sarah Stankorb along with Peter Bell, the host of the Sons of Patriarchy podcast. The two of them appeared on stage in Moscow at an event during Doug Wilson's Grace Agenda recruitment weekend, and it coincided with coverage by CNN, who interviewed Wilson and his men and captured some rather misogynistic, racist, and homophobic comments that went viral. The focus of my conversation with Stankorb and Bell in episode 48 was about how the residents of Moscow wished the media would cover Wilson. Given their connections to those on the ground, I figured Stankorb and Bell could give us some insight into that. But I also wanted to talk to someone who lived in Moscow myself, and I wanted to write a story about what was going on as well. So I set up an interview with Sarah Bader, who is the majority owner of the Sons of Patriarchy podcast that Bell hosts, and who has been working with survivors on the ground in Moscow for many years. And then just as I was about to interview her and write the piece, Peter Bell went on the Sons of Patriarchy Facebook page and kind of dropped a bomb. I explained what happened in detail in my latest piece for Baptist News Global this week, titled, "In Fight Against Patriarchy, Women Are Not Listened To." I'd highly recommend reading that story in its entirety because it connects the thread of authoritarianism from Moscow to Washington, D.C., it explains the Sons of Patriarchy controversy that exploded this week, and it reflects on how we all need to heal from the poison of patriarchy. In short, Bell posted on the Sons of Patriarchy Facebook page, without notifying the rest of the team about his post ahead of time, that he'd been addicted to porn for close to 20 years, had been fired from multiple jobs and ministries over the years for lying, that he recorded the first season of the show while he and his wife were separated, and that he wasn't the savior so many people were looking to him to be. In the days following his post, hundreds of comments began pouring in on multiple platforms, with some people calling for Bell to be inducted into the Hebrews 11 Hall of Faith, or comparing him to the Apostle Paul for his honesty, and others saying he reminds them of their abusive ex-husband or pastor. So, with all of that swirling in the background, I sat down with Sarah Bader this week to discuss her thoughts about it all. And one thing that stands out to me in all this is not simply her answers to my questions, but the toll you can feel the patriarchy has had on her. These aren't simply secondary or tertiary issues and topics that good Christians can debate and disagree with one another on. These ideas that Wilson puts forth are sacralizations of power that traumatize and take a toll on women. So, I hope as you listen to this interview, you'll learn from Bader's wisdom about what's happening on the ground in Moscow, underneath the boot of Wilson and his men. And I hope you'll reflect on how that's being spread to the nation through their disciples in Washington, D.C. But I also hope you'll connect with her humanity, that you'll feel how tired and underwater she feels. This is not a head-to-head exercise in the clashing of concepts. Women's lives are on the line. So I interviewed Sarah Stankorb and Peter Bell a couple weeks ago about the event that Sons of Patriarchy put on in Moscow during Doug Wilson's Grace Agenda conference. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how those on the ground who live in Moscow felt about how the meeting went.
So I can tell you with great confidence how the people on the ground in Moscow felt because I can't leave my door without hearing how people felt about the event. Overwhelmingly, it has been positive reception. Christians, atheists, I've pretty much run into them all at this point. Going to the pet store the other day, someone had been at the event and I just didn't recognize them out of the crowd, and thanked me and said congratulations. And I think that's really what I would like to take away from it, is that Moscow showed up in a way that they have not in a long time, if ever. And I think the people in Moscow were really, really reassured and feel that camaraderie and that sense of community by having a vast array of parties just interested in this one thing. We really don't feel like this is Christ-like. We really do not feel like this represents our community and is harmful. And I think everyone that was there, or hopefully everyone that was there, that was their intention.
That's one thing I've appreciated about your gathering was how it's not like a monolith of everyone being of the same mindset. You do have the atheists and the religious people of like across the spectrum there together with that common cause. So I think that speaks to the strength of the community too.
I think that's what the best of Moscow. For me, after having some hardships with Moscow and very mixed feelings about this area and what has happened here, it was so redemptive to see all these different people loving each other and working together. I was very, very happy and very proud of Moscow.
Yeah. So at some point during the weekend, I noticed that the Sons of Patriarchy released a picture of you and Peter speaking with Doug Wilson. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd imagine you're probably not expecting Wilson to change his mind in an instant about his ideas about things. But as someone who lives there in Moscow, like, how do you process to what degree you want to speak truth to power by confronting these men directly, or speaking truth in hopes that, like, the women and the children underneath those men might hear and feel drawn to leave them and to stand up for themselves?
That's a good question. I am under no illusion that Doug Wilson's mind will not be changed by Peter, by me, really by anyone. Doug has solidified himself in his route, and only Doug can change his own mind. And for those Christians, God can change Doug's mind, but we people cannot. What I think this community craves is accountability. And I think that we are all owed that from Doug. And I believe that Peter can hold Doug accountable in a way that many others theologically can't. The other side of it is that Doug refuses to acknowledge women. And I think my presence there was important just as a voice to say, we're still here, we're still fighting, and we aren't going to submit to this. Um, I think that the women see that engagement and see that power, and I hope that they also feel empowered. There's the softer side of it too, where I believe sharing those stories and including women continuously helps shadow and show that we are part of this journey. We are the movement, and we are what will bring, I hope, healing to our community.
So a day or two before your event, CNN came in and interviewed Wilson, and since then they've released more and more of the interview. And but I'd love to hear your thoughts on what it's like for those who live there when some big name from CNN comes in. Like, are people in Moscow excited to talk to CNN? Are they hesitant? If they're hesitant, like what's happened in with national coverage in the past that might make them feel that way?
I think that when these big name groups drop into town, they don't understand the coding, the language. They don't understand when Doug says X, he really means Y. Oftentimes they don't know the history that Doug may claim something, but historically speaking, he has always done, his actions have shown something else, and they don't hold him accountable. I think that when they drop into town, they don't understand the situation, they don't understand the community, they don't understand what Doug has done and what he is doing. He may say one thing, but he's doing entirely another thing. And Moscow's pretty used to that. We see it all the time. We have experienced this. I just always feel disappointed in national news. I feel like they don't ask the hard questions. They don't hold Doug's feet to the fire. They don't keep pressing him when he gives a non-answer, which is his kind of normal defense. I think there are just some things that get dropped, and I think there's a little bit of pressure to play nice, not understanding how horrific the real situation is.
Yeah. And then now, like that event was in that interview was probably 2 weeks ago. So now you're kind of in that stage where it's like 2 weeks later, they're gone, and real life is kind of setting in again.
Yeah, so I think people get really excited in Moscow, like, hey, maybe this time we're going to get help because I feel like Moscow thinks they don't have any power anymore and that we're just at the mercy of what's happening to us. And it does help to get a little bit of outside eyes on this situation, especially as Doug's influence has grown and his empire has grown. It just feels really deflating when, yeah, they've walked out of town and we're still left with this mess. And they really didn't do anything or help us. And since then, I understand that CNN has released the full version. But from what I've heard, having not watched it myself, I've heard that there are still cuts. And I would really love to see the full version. I cannot imagine a female reporter as sharp as she was letting some of those statements go.
So one thing I have loved about your event was how like you guys didn't just swoop in. You didn't just grab sound bites from Wilson and then leave, But like you guys hung out, you invited people into conversation, especially those who Wilson has harmed. And it felt like the intention of the event was to cultivate community by centering and amplifying the voices of those who have been harmed. And since then, we saw the announcement of the apparent face-off between Peter Bell and Doug Wilson, which may or may not happen now. I don't know. And then over the weekend, Bell wrote a rather long post on the Sons of Patriarchy page about some of his personal issues and shortcomings and how those have affected the podcast. And it led to a lot of really strong reaction, including some words from you. So I was curious if you wouldn't mind sharing kind of your perspective on some of that and maybe how Sons of Patriarchy plans to make sure the focus going forward stays on centering and amplifying the voices of those who have been harmed by Wilson.
Yeah, so I think maybe addressing Peter's words first. He really, I think the CNN situation and then just the coverage, that media coverage we received, it really jumped us outside of our ability to handle just numbers of messages, the attention, and some of the attention has been really, really helpful. A lot of the attention is so heartbreaking, and we've both been under a lot of pressure to how do we help these people? How do we help these people? And there's an interesting response in trauma, and I'm not an advocate, but I see it over and over again, having done whatever it is I do. Um, but there's that fawn response. And Peter and I have been negotiating this for a very long time together, and it has been more and more clear that a female voice was not wanted. I think maybe if you read the comments, there were people outright saying that. Sorry. Peter is still deconstructing from what patriarchy has done to these men. I think he is a good example of really how crappy this system is. We fight all the time. We are like siblings. We hash it out and we talk as our group, as a family. We really get into it with each other sometimes, but it's always resolved with love and oftentimes a big change from one of us. I am grateful that Peter has given me the space he has, because to be honest, sometimes the women just don't get far. I have been doing this work for a decade. I know others who have been doing this work for a decade. We are not listened to. And I think if you go through those comments, you'll see a lot of that of, well, I would have listened to this podcast, but now it's woke because there's a woman. Like, hate to
Yeah.
break it to you guys, but it kind of, I've always been the owner of Sons of Patriarchy. We just didn't make a big deal out of it. So when Peter and I have both been struggling and we are both working with the same therapist. We're trying to deal with how to better communicate and how to better get these survivors help. But I think what prompted that particular post um, was that we both feel like we've been put on this pedestal of um, kind of like a savior for Peter, and for me, just this on the ground, like I'm supposed to be the superhero, and I want help so bad. We both do. But these are not things we can solve. So you'll notice in season two, we stopped doing survivor stories because we had noticed, that we had this hole of communication, and really it had gotten so out of control because there were, I think, quite literally hundreds of people wanting to tell us stories. And not all of them are not all of them were CREC, OPC, and it just started getting bigger and bigger. And basically, I started feeling like people were saying, come save the Christian world. And sure, we want to, but how do we do that? And so we stopped taking survivor stories because we didn't feel like we were doing it in a way that reflected how much we care about about how we take those stories in and how we platform them, whether or not they're true. We have an entire fact checking team that goes through, and it's a really arduous process. And it was starting to get less and less carefully monitored. So I think that post yesterday from Peter was a response to just, look, I'm a human being too. And I am not a big professor of personal stuff. Um, Peter has already mentioned this. It was brought up in November of last year. Uh, I think most survivors knew. We have had a really great discourse with the survivors on the side just to make sure that they have felt heard, and there's hurt. And that is something that we are grappling with right now. Thus leading to my post, which is, Peter's position has not changed. He is still the co-owner. We've both always been the co-owners. He's still the host, but we are acknowledging that the post caused both healing and hurt, and we're trying to navigate that. So in that sense, that's where those two posts came from. The one-on-one with Doug, really, again, it goes back to accountability. I think there are a lot of questions we have. I don't have theological questions. I just have mostly a lot of questions about the crimes he has
Hmm.
committed, or helped cover up, his permissive language. I don't think I'll get any answers to my questions, but I know Peter can press them theologically where I can't. So that's the beauty of our we're us working together, is he's theological. I've got kind of the Moscow side of things.
Hmm.
Um, so somehow hopefully we'll kind of get that married together. I don't honestly believe Doug's ever intended on being good on his word. I was standing right next to Peter. I heard what Doug said. I heard what Peter said. Um, the stipulations were odd, but not out of control, and we agreed to them. There is no reason for Doug to back out. We have promised to keep crowd control and angry outbursts to a minimum, if not altogether not have it. I mean, a little concerned after these last few posts. We've had some really angry people and a lot of yelling that seemed unnecessary. Um, but our goal is to have an open discussion with Doug, because we just have some questions for him, and
Hmm.
I'm hoping that he's there to answer.
Do you feel like maybe some of the remnants of patriarchy has its fingerprints on situations like this? Because like a lot of us, I don't know your exact background, but a lot of us are coming out of these churches, and so it's tempting for a lot of us guys to play the role of a pastor, even if we're not in a church setting. And then there's also possibly a pattern where people who listen to podcasts or read books might look to podcasters or authors as like a spiritual authority. Like their previous pastor. And so it's like all of us are coming to this conversation from a place of religious trauma. Um, and we all have patterns of relating to voices.
Yeah, so circling back to that like fawn response, that is not to put blame on anyone, but that's natural. They're looking to Peter, and it's something that Peter and I kind of have hashed out several times in sometimes a little bit of yelling. Mostly me. I'm the yeller. He's really quiet and nice. Unlike the podcast, we kind of have the opposites in personality. I'm the more flash anger person. He's more chill. Um, but going back to that, I think that fawn response is so strong, and people will find out I'm the one that's actually been talking to them, or I'm the one that knows more than Peter, and he'll refer them to me, and they will outright not speak to me. Not just because I'm a woman. It's really tough. So we have been grappling with that. We also, yes, there's a massive, even amongst our team, we're having to define like, hey, we are not a ministry. We're literally a grassroots podcast with a bunch of people that just our only rule, well, we have a few rules, and I won't go into all of them, but you know, there's two. Honesty, always, no matter what. We're going to find the truth. And if we found out we were wrong, we're going to correct it because honesty is what we do, it's not what they do. Our second rule is you don't touch the children. It's literally that simple. And so all religions, all backgrounds of political spectrum are acceptable. We don't all agree with each other, and we keep it very polite when we don't. But those are those rules we abide by. And I think that pretty much everyone can get on board. It's then getting everyone on board without it becoming, like you said, these people just listening to a podcast and looking for a savior and looking for another pastor and another person to follow. And while talking to Peter, it was kind of this moment of like, hey, things are kind of, things, I know your heart and I know what you're talking about, but you sound like things are kind of going to your head a little here, man. And he really hit the nail on the head. And I had a really good discussion with a few other CREC um ex-evangelicals or whatever you would want to call them. I don't think they consider themselves ex-evangelicals, but they have left the CREC. And men I really respect and have great hearts. And I see them further along in their journey, but I also see where Peter is headed. And he said, look, I'm just deconstructing too. And it was a big wake up call that, yeah, I am many, many years on my journey out of the CREC and church in general. I'm pretty confident, pretty happy with where I'm at spiritually, but I imagine it is so hard to still be going through that. And so, yeah, we have to talk with our team. We have to communicate, make sure that everyone knows that, we're just a podcast. We're just a lot of people that really don't believe this is Christianity. I mean, I'm an atheist saying this is not Christianity, and I'm really here to defend Christians, real Christ-like people. And I've never met more of them since starting this podcast. I hope that answered your question. It was really
Yeah.
long-winded. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. So just kind of wrapping this up, as Wilson expands his influence through church planting, especially in DC, and through all the attention he's getting, like, how do you balance your local focus in Moscow with some of the more national concerns as people are starting to feel nationally a lot of the fear that you guys have felt locally in Moscow? Like how do you make sure you're not taking too much? You can't take the whole nation on your shoulders, you know? Um, do you just kind of have to take it week by week at this point?
How about hour by hour? Um, there's a lot of right now, I'm kind of in the ha, I told you so mode. I
Hmm.
literally have family members like, oh, sorry, you weren't crazy. Yes, maybe a little crazy, but I wasn't wrong. Um, I think the thing that shocked me the most was when I was having the event was such a big thing for me that I had to tune out of the internet. So I didn't know CNN happened. So for me walking into this event, everyone else knew. I was completely clueless. And when I saw that and so many people were talking to me, my family was talking to me about this issue and wanting to, we saw what you're talking about. We saw him say that women shouldn't be voting. Um, the horrible people that people come out of comment. Um, it was it's been terrifying, and I have such a local focus. None of the other team is actually local. So I will go off well, sorry, Helen Shores is also local. Um, but I'll go off about local things. And then I need to remember that, nope, this issue is now bigger. So in some ways, I'm still stuck here in Moscow trying to save Moscow. The ship has sunk and I can't give it up, but I do understand the issue's bigger. So for me, it's really a reminder that Moscow really screwed up. And my hope is that we as a community can heal, but I don't think we'll ever get back what we gave up.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on, and I know it's a vulnerable and difficult thing to talk about, but I appreciate your bravery and willingness to speak up.
Well, thank you. And I know that other members of our team really, really admire you, and Sarah does. I appreciate you giving me the time. Sorry about being a little scattered today.
No, you're totally fine.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
At the end of my piece this week about this story, I shared a statement by Sarah Stankorb. Because Stankorb has worked with the women of Moscow for years, appeared on stage with Bell, and understands the implications of Moscow's patriarchy for our nation, I wanted her to have the space to share her thoughts, especially in light of the vulnerabilities so many on the underside of patriarchy feel. So I'm going to close this episode by reading Stankorb's statement to BNG. These are the words of Sarah Stankorb. The Moscow event went so well and meant a lot to that community. I worry, in light of Peter Bell's post, we're losing the thread. Christian nationalism is a danger, not only to us nationally, but as it plays out in everyday people's lives. It comes paired with Christian patriarchy, a form of dominion that I know from far too many first-hand accounts hurts women. It hurts children. It hurts men, too. I do see some of that in Bell's post. He seems to have wanted to show the damage he carries. I worry doing so comes at the cost of the survivors who should be at the center of this conversation, because they offer warning about what this model of faith does to people. Though, I suppose, in a way, Bell's confession, the details, and that he evidently posted it without consulting his team, demonstrate some of that too. It blindsided a lot of survivors and other advocates whose trust is already fragile. It also has created a huge distraction from the work of making Wilson's impact visible. I find myself torn. I watched comments flood in on Facebook in response to his post, mostly positive, glowing in the way I've seen too many times when men in evangelical circles reckon with mistakes or wrongdoing. It is a reactive warmth that I know is connected to theologies of confession and forgiveness, but also one that in other contexts I've seen absolutely skip over reckoning with what went wrong. It was this pattern that disturbed me the most. Then when Sarah Bader, whom I have covered twice, for Vice and Disobedient Women, posted a statement afterward, I saw a split among Sons of Patriarchy followers. Some survivors were grateful, but there was a lot of pushback, calling Bader's response, which was compassionate to Bell and survivors who were upset by his post, woke, or people didn't want to hear from a woman. The whole thing replicates what has happened over and over among people coming out of communities like this. Women have been declaring the damage for years, but something about a man holding the mic, even when it was women survivors talking into it, made the warnings more palatable to people who were steeped in Christian patriarchy. On one level, I understand. This is how they view the world. By habit, they elevate men. On another, it is so frustrating. Those who are the most oppressed within the system have the most to teach us. Bader and others have been shouldering the work on an ongoing daily basis for years and years, far beyond the podcast, and instead just helping survivors meet their basic needs. Why is transparency about problem behavior by a man lauded, and she's so often invisible? That photo that shot around everywhere after Bell talked to Doug Wilson about having him on the show, Bader was there too. When I asked her about approaching him and walking through Grace Agenda, she told me how she was rammed and pushed into by Kirker men as the two cut a path through the outdoor gathering. Maybe Bell didn't notice, he's much bigger than Bader, but she felt the physical shoves and stood her ground. To top it off, in response to that photo, I read one commenter who wondered what her husband thought about the length of her shorts. Seriously. I see something rather rare in how she handled all of this. It is clear she has a deep friendship with Bell, that she wants to give him space to figure things out, and that she is shouldering the mess, as she always has done, while also continuing to do and deal with the toll of incredibly difficult work. No one person, of whatever gender, is going to save us from Christian nationalism or Christian patriarchy. To tackle such entrenched worldviews takes discipline and teamwork. Bader is exhibiting those traits with aplomb. Yet the overall public response shows how much men are needed within the movement to confront and dismantle Christian patriarchy, especially some who have dedicated as many years deconstructing the ideology that can otherwise make a person blind to their own limitations. But good grief, can we also acknowledge the women who have been doing it all along? Those who already had to overcome a subculture that didn't value them as much? And when things get messy, and they do get messy, because most advocates have themselves been hurt by these teachings, can we notice how often women get stuck cleaning up those messes too? That's also part of centering survivors. That's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Please like, subscribe, and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, and we'll be back with another episode on Monday.
This has been another change-making conversation from Baptist News Global. The episode you've just heard is part of a special podcast series titled Highest Power, Church and State. Be sure to follow BNG daily at baptistnews.com and subscribe to get notifications about future episodes. Baptist News Global is a national nonprofit news service that is independent, free, and faithful. BNG is supported by readers and listeners like you. Learn more at baptistnews.com.
This episode was produced and edited by Mac Bowles of TKG Communications, LLC, Dallas, Texas.